thank you very much for joining us today at this Financial Times webinar in our series Reflect, Restart and Rethink about the future of business education in the era of COVID. We're presenting today in partnership with St. Gallen, and this particular seminar would have formed the basis of a workshop at an EFMD discussion we were due to have in April, before, of course, coronavirus got in the way and started to cause such enormous disruption around the world to business education and the world beyond. But we're delighted to offer this online version that we want to make as interactive and discursive as possible. It'll also be made available afterwards, so you don't have to be simply tapping in live, but very keen to encourage everyone who's watching to participate actively, to use the Zoom Q&A function here to post any questions you have for our great panel, and also your own reflections and experiences over the next hour or so. So our aim is to talk really in this session about teaching, and in this time of enormous disruption, acceleration of changes, questions about how education and business education can add value in this fast evolving world, we thought it would be very interesting to try to understand the idea of making and keeping education and teaching as relevant and up to date as possible through the integration of real-time sources. We're going to talk in part about what we would like to see as the value of the FT as part of that process, but also more generally other media, other sources that are available online, whether it's reporting, analysis, data, and other information that keeps teaching fresh, and to really understand the different ways in which faculty and students directly, librarians and information scientists, and students directly in their own learning can take advantage of fresh, relevant insights to make the most of their time. So we've got a great panel here today, and in the first 20 minutes or so, we're going to have an initial introductory presentation, short presentation by Simon Evernett from St. Gallen, and then I'm going to turn to our other three panelists, Antonio Fatas from INSEAD, Kevin Mack from Stanford, and Mary Stone from University of Alabama, to share some of their experiences. Then we'll have a bit of a conversation, and I'd encourage you, as I say, as soon as possible to join in through the Q&A that we'll all be looking at and responding to as part of our discussion and beyond. But first of all then, Simon, let me turn to you. Great to hear a little bit about your reflections on how to integrate information, how you're using it, what the applications have been, what some of the lessons are maybe in the experiences to date.
Thank you, Andrew, and I'd like to thank you and your team for putting together this series of presentations. I've put on the screen here a short presentation of the different ways in which we integrate real-time insights into the St. Gallen MBA curriculum. And I think the first thing I should do is to start with why bother? Why? What's the purpose of that? And I think real-time insights serve four important purposes. And we take the view that our MBAs come to us for career acceleration and career transformation. And the first reason then is that we have found that employers in this part of the world expect MBAs to be complex business solvers. So they expect MBAs to have good silo knowledge in each of the core courses, but also to be able to integrate those insights to tackle real world problems. That dovetails very nicely with what we're finding with our MBAs. Our MBAs like relevant up-to-date material. Nothing puts them off with material case studies which are 10, 20 years out of date, or slides which are out of date. So being able to use real-time insights based on matters that they may have heard about or seen on the news or on the web is actually really valuable. The faculty buy into this increasingly because they want high levels of MBA engagement. Every faculty member knows that with a laptop in front of a student, that the faculty member is competing against whatever social media channels are available. So the content the faculty has got to provide has got to be really relevant and seen to be of interest to the students. And we found the real-time insights help with that. And the final very important reason why real-time insights are important is because, as we've seen, there's a rethink going on about what's expected of managers and of capitalists capitalism more generally. And one way in which you can make decision makers more socially aware is to get them to look beyond their own personal circumstances to what's going on in the business environment and in society more generally. And of course, various media sources and the like are great places to do that. So these are the 4 reasons why we have taken the view that real-time insights add to an MBA curriculum and education. What I want to do now is to go through 4 of the case uses or case examples that we use to give you a sense about how real-time insights are actually implemented. The first is perhaps the most basic, which is to get to use up-to-date examples to help get the MBAs to apply the core course material that they're learning, or what we call the MBA Toolkit. And here we do 2 things. First, we get our MBAs to critique the use of tools by others. And so on the left-hand side is an example I use whenever I'm teaching Porter's 5 Forces, where essentially one particular letter writer to the Financial Times did an absolutely awful job applying Porter's 5 Forces to the audit sector in Europe. And so what we use this example for is one of to get students to critically reflect on someone else's application of the tool. More constructively, on the right-hand side, we get students to apply the tools to be able to understand, better understand the value of tools and the insights that they bring. And so we work from the principle that whatever is not practiced is not learned. And MBAs quickly tune out material which they don't think has any practical value. And since I'm an economist, we get our MBAs to use supply and demand tools based on articles, normally in the FT, about major shifts in commodity prices. We also have, there are other examples we use, like changes in rent controls, tariffs and the like. All of these lead themselves to the use of supply and demand tools. And here, this is just an example about how we use FT material, for example, to get students to use the tools themselves. So critique and apply is the first use case example. The second use case example is to nurture critical thinking skills. And this is important because as MBAs start developing a holistic understanding of a business situation, they have to interpret the different writings of others. And these, of course, come from not just the FT, but from other important sources like Bloomberg and alike, The Economist magazine. And essentially, in each of these cases, we need our MBAs to be able to deconstruct arguments and see what their strengths and weaknesses are. And in doing this, we teach our MBAs how to apply pyramid thinking and the Nisi principle. And one of the articles we use for that is a piece by Gillian Tett talking about how businesses are engaging with the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we get our MBAs to see where Gillian has used the principles of principled thinking well, and how they could have improved upon her argument and how they could have supported it with more evidence. So this is very much getting MBAs to think a lot more systematically and critically, and getting them over a hurdle which many of them typically default into, which is to try and tell the professor what they think the professor wants to hear, rather than developing their own perspective. And great real-time insights enable students to do that. The third use case example that we have is when we take our MBAs through how to look at complex business problems, we often emphasize to them the importance of looking for precedent cases to see what they might shed light on the underlying structural factors that are involved, the options available to firms, and how those options played out. And here we often emphasize the link between dramatic events which can happen to a firm and its implications for both strategy and for the financials of the firm. And so the leading example we use is the emissions scandal, which of course hit the German automobile company. And the expectation was that there would be big fines which would hit these particular companies. It turns out that there is a history of automobile fines in the United States for car makers who've broken different types of rules, often environmental rules. And so what we want our MBAs to be able to do is to use current real-time insights plus precedent cases which they research themselves to be able to influence how they would look at the current situation. So use previous auto fines examples to help understand how vulnerable VW was to the emissions scandal. And this, of course, builds on the techniques of Tetlock and Gardner in their horribly or misnamed book, Super Forecasting. This book should actually be called How to Think Clearly About Most Business Situations. But it's a great way of combining their insights plus good material to get our MBAs to see that not every situation they tackle is unique. In fact, many of them have precedents which are worth using. So this is a second building block, which takes us to the last use case, which really is for us the apex of the use of our real-time insights. And this is when we get our MBAs to tackle real-world business situations and cases based on Financial Times articles. And now our goal here is to give an MBA a challenging business problem, which should be looked at multiple perspectives and multiple tools from the MBA toolkit. And so in the case I have on the left-hand side, we take a company, a large multinational company, 3M, who had fourth quarter results which were reported, and the company was in trouble, so they announced a transformation plan. And so then, of course, the interesting question arises, does the transformation plan really constitute a change in strategy? Will it fix the underperformance of the firm? And so we get our MBAs to think about this problem from both a corporate strategy dimension and a financial performance dimension. And of course, we bring in the views of other experts because we encourage our MBAs to look for real-time insights from stock market analysts and like, or analysts at investment banks who also have a view. And so we then get our MBAs, we organize this in the following way. We have individual case-solving sprints. We give our MBAs this question for something like 24 hours, and then they have to hand in their PowerPoint presentation, which will be 10 minutes long. They present to corporate and academic jurors. We grill them for a significant period of time, and they get immediate and direct feedback. Now, the students gain a lot from this, but importantly, so do we. That is those of us who are faculty as well as the people running our programs, because this exercise really highlights what deficiencies our MBAs have. And after each day of doing these sprints, we have a very unsparing and honest discussion about what went well and what went badly. And faculty and I talk through how we're going to improve the course and programs next year. And the other team members, also the program team, also talk through how we're going to offer supporting measures to help our students do better. For example, sometimes giving a student an article to read is one thing, and then being able to help them research further so that they know where to look and what's high quality information is important support as well. And of course, being able to answer questions to present are important skills as well. So this is the fourth case, use case for real-time insights that we have. Let me just wrap up with some thoughts about how we can support faculty using real-time insights. I think there are several steps that we can take here, some by the faculty, some by content providers, some by program directors. The faculty could start sharing more actively case examples on a dedicated site, and we could set this up and provide, of course, we could have faculty only access where we have questions and supporting material. And of course, for those people using any one common source of real-time content like the FT, you can imagine that this could be organized more centrally. Secondly, we could have faculty debrief sessions to share best practices on how to use real-time insights, what types of challenges the students come up with, how we've helped them tackle those challenges. I think that these days in an age of Zoom and alike, these types of debrief sessions could happen very, very easily. We're perhaps within each region of the world, so that some of our colleagues based in Singapore don't have to stay up right until midnight, and some of our colleagues on the East Coast don't have to get up and start working before breakfast. Then we could also, I think more generally, we want faculty to experiment with the move towards virtual delivery in the flipped classroom, which this often involves. And flipped classrooms involve devising excellent exercises, and those exercises can often be based on real-time content. Content providers can support all of this by assembling collections of content which are linked to either to core courses or to tools within those core courses. So I already mentioned how I've assembled some content which links to the use of Porter's 5 forces and supply and demand tools, and one could think about core tools which are used in many different curricula. then program directors should, I think, jump on real-time insights and the types of sprints that we make our MBAs do to highlight where their students are learning and what their students are facing difficulties. So this is a great way to identify MBA learning gaps through these types of exercises. And finally, of course, I think every faculty member is humble enough to realize that at some point the MBAs start discounting our pleas that they should, or encouragement that they should know more about what's going on in the world. When our MBAs hear from alumni and from corporates that this is something they put a huge premium on, it really adds and reinforces the message. And so I think a smart program director brings together alumni and corporates to help reinforce that message as well, so that the faculty can see that the students can see that the faculty are aligned with what the job market wants. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Simon. A really helpful starting point, and plenty of issues there I'd like to come back to. But let me move around to our other participants briefly a little bit to hear some of their reflections. And as you mentioned, Antonio Fatas here is sitting in Singapore very kindly, quite late at night, as a reminder of this new virtual global world that we're living in business education. Let me come to you first, Antonio. I mean, tell us a little bit about your experiences and applications at INSEAD in your teaching of real-time sources. What are you using? What are you finding useful, and with what impact?
Thank you, Andrew. I want to give a perspective which maybe goes back a few years, maybe many years ago, and I'm going to date myself by doing that. A lot of the things that Simon said, if you think about it, we've been doing some of that for years. At least from my point of view, when the internet was born and I created my first course website, that's what I felt like. I felt like I had a window to the world, a window to share with my students, links to data, links to the Financial Times, links to other media sources, and they could sort of navigate this world and they come back to class and make a more interesting discussion after the experience by themselves. So I think we've been doing a lot of that, and I think the world has changed in a direction that we're all more ready to do that, more able to do that, and there's more and more information online, including great sources of real-time data to do that. Now, my experience over the last 6 months have been very interesting, because as I was doing the same, but I was teaching my class online using the same tool we're using right now, Zoom, I realized that this virtual world, which in many ways is not ideal to teach, became ideal to use real-time data. Because I didn't have to tell my students at the end of class, not go and check online this or that and see if you can find a case of a central bank that uses a different policy than other ones. I could do it in real time with them. The fact that we're all sort of looking at the same window, and this is the same window that allows them to explore all these source of information and data and real-time data out there, allows me to sort of do immediate exercises with my participants, either send them to an individual assignment or to a group assignment, where they can immediately go to the country of their choice, analyze their country that they're more interested in, come back, and we can have a much more interesting discussion. So the perspective that I've had over the last month is, I think we've seen an acceleration of our ability to use real-time data. And real-time data means news, but also means data which is published everywhere. I mean, I'll give an example from the Financial Times. All these great trackers of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, are very, very useful when you want your students to sort of go out there and check a particular country, how that country is doing, and how to think about the economic consequences of the pandemic. So I think, I mean, I've seen an acceleration, and I think this acceleration is here to stay. Whether we come back soon to face-to-face classes or not, I think it's not going to matter that much. I think all of us are now more used, and all of us as faculty, but also participants, to use real-time data, and it's just going to become so natural in the future to make even a bigger use of it.
Thanks. Let's move on round. Mary, University of Alabama, tell us a little bit about how your teaching has evolved over the past few years.
Thank you, Andrew. I teach advanced accounting, which is a traditionally very technical course, but I'm now able to do the flipped classroom, which means that I can bring each day, I have the students work on the technical before class, and then we use many cases in class that have them apply what they've learned in their preparation for class. And one of the examples I'm working on now, there's was recently an FT article on mafia bonds. And so just a title that captures students' attention. And the story is that there was a special purpose entity created to take the cash flows from different entities, securitize them, and sell them to banks, pension funds, hedge funds. And so that case allows me to ask questions for groups to work on in their Zoom meetings about, well, what are the valuation issues? What are the ways that these could be risky investments? What kind of risk does an auditor have when he or she tries to audit these investments? How can that risk be reduced? What are the responsibilities of the advisor who suggested that pension funds invest in these securities? So there's a whole series of questions that I could use, and many of the points that Simon made about the skills that MBA needs are true for accounting students, but I think they also need more of an emphasis on valuation. What are the basic models for valuation? How do you judge the qualities of the inputs? How do you judge the reasonableness of the outputs? Again, risk. What's the risk inherent in different types of investments? What's the risk that passes down to consultants that recommend those investments, auditors that have clients who have made those investments? What happens when there's a market downturn? And certainly now, with the pandemic and the increasing number of companies that are filing for protection from bankruptcy protection in the States, there's lots of opportunities to talk about impairment of assets, how that kind of valuation works. One of the recent articles I'm using to get students to think about the difference between buying a going concern versus pieces of a business is the article related to WiseCard and all of the different entities that are lined up to bid for different pieces of WiseCard. And so that gives me the chance to ask questions about that. Up until this spring semester, my practice was to write my short cases on the weekend prior to the week I'd use them in class, because I liked being able to say to the students, this came from Thursday's Financial Times or Thursday's Wall Street Journal. With the need to have all of my materials ready for the online students on the first day of class, I can no longer do that. So I won't be able to emphasize the importance of staying up to date in the same way that I could before, but still I think everything I'm using this fall is within the last 6 months. Another thing that I do is I bring in audit analytics and other databases which we're able to search on the Zoom sections and find out the areas where companies receive comments from the Securities and Exchange Commission about their accounting practices, and then discuss, well, what went wrong? How would you have identified the problem before the Securities and Exchange Commission did?
Thanks very much for that. Really, really helpful. Yeah, and I shall share the links, but the Mafia bond story certainly performed extremely well with our readers, amongst others, for some strange reason. Very topical. Well, we'll come back to some of those themes as well, and really, really helpful, Mary. But let's turn to Kevin now briefly and tell us a little bit about both what you focus on, and again how with your deep experience, exposure, immersion in the digital world of finding, navigating, and adapting your teaching methods currently.
Sure. My financial trading strategies course basically talks about the nuts and bolts of hedge funds and institutional investing. And really what I think the biggest focus that I try to push on the course is the idea of like decision making with uncertainty. And there's a really big push in recent times with sort of quantitative investing and looking at the numbers and running algorithms and data mining and machine learning and all that kind of stuff. What I really like about sort of real-time resources and resources like Financial Times is it kind of pushes everyone to slow down a little bit and think back about the idea that people are making decisions for these companies, and there's information that does need to be parsed and read through and discussed and thought through. And so a good example is something like merger arbitrage. The amount of context and color behind negotiations and rumors and all those things that are happening in the markets that are really driving prices. The only way you can get access or information like that, aside from being on Wall Street or in London, is to be reading the Financial Times or reading Bloomberg or reading Wall Street Journal. And so I'm regularly pushing my students to be more involved with the business journalism and understanding what's happening in the markets. In terms of real time versus historical, for me, it's always been very natural that real time was effectively the only way to teach. When people try to analyze historical situations, they have a lot of look back biases and a lot of hindsight principles that are going on, versus saying, hey, you know what, here's the situation that's going on right now, let's talk about it. And from a faculty member perspective, that's scary because you're talking about something that you have no idea what's going to happen versus being able to teach a case from historically. And so I think there's a lot going on there, a lot to unpack, and I'm looking forward to talking more about it with all these panelists.
Sorry, apologies for that. Let me just start going a bit retro, and just kind of flicking backwards. Simon, you'd mentioned case studies, of course, and the frustration of students of kind of, you know, using ones that are 20 years old, let's say. But I mean, playing devil's advocate to all of you, I mean, there is presumably still, I mean, obviously, apart from the practical issue of some tied and tested case studies and old style print textbooks even, I mean, presumably some of them do still have a real shelf life and a value, you know, and sometimes there could be a danger of being obsessed with the latest trend or headline, as it were, when a lot of the kind of the really deeply researched messages and lessons actually do last a long time. So what would you say is the right balance, and how to perhaps continue to use but then enrich older but reliable golden materials in your teaching?
So I think it's a great question. I mean, in my presentation, I gave the example of how one of your readers had sent in a lousy letter. That letter was actually from 2011. So it's actually 9 years old. And so I think the interesting thing about real-time content is that faculty can build up a library of some of which is really up to date and current, and you can see why when you listen to Kevin present, you know, about how his course, how that makes sense. But of course, there are sometimes just classic learnings which come back over time. So I don't want people to take away the impression that only the most current stuff matters. But I do think if you want to get MBAs to think that there's something worth learning in a case study which is 10 or 20 years, you have to work a little bit harder for them to see the contemporary relevance of this. And maybe you combine that vintage case with contemporary parallel or examples, and then they can begin to see the value of understanding the vintage case. And you know, implied in, you know, Kevin's observation, the nice thing about a vintage case is we know how it ended, right? We know how we know what actually happened in the end. So I think again, like all things, you want to blend the two, but I don't see why we can't build up libraries of great content, even if some of that content is a little bit older than the more recent stuff.
Yes, no, it is certainly interesting looking back at some old case studies that were at that stage rather positive about, let's say, certain practices and financing mechanisms that have since turned rather sour. It's also interesting, Simon, you had to delve back so many years to find a piece of comment on the FT to critique. Of course, I'd say one thing that you know, is valuable is because of the nature of our readers and who they are. The reader comments beneath articles and opinion pieces are often actually incredibly valuable. And I certainly find sort of reordering by most recommended and so on, you can get a very rich seam of highly intelligent and informed debate often. But I don't know, Kevin, maybe coming to you. I mean, you're I'm sure a sort of digital first person, but I mean, do you find also there is some value in the kind of the old and the print and the retro?
Sure.
Or are you totally digital?
No, Antonio's start was funny because he was talking about dating himself, and I can date myself in saying that ever since I've taught, there's always been an internet. So all of this real-time thing was very, very sort of obvious and natural to me. I do want to clarify, I do agree with Simon, like reading historical case studies absolutely is helpful for building knowledge. I guess two things is one, what I disliked was when people are like, if you were the CEO 10 years ago in this situation, what would you have done? That concept of like trying to analyze it back then is difficult. Also, I have an investing course, so at the end of the day, the decisions are should you have bought or should you have sold, and when you know whether you would have made money or lost money, it's really hard to force people into that world. Versus on a strategy course or something like that, where it does actually make more sense for people to look at the situation and understand how that strategic model applied. In terms of real time, it's really hard. It's really hard to put these resources together. And I think that what Simon's talking about with having some sort of like online database or centralizing it, instead of having every single faculty member reinvent the wheel every single time, it is helpful. But it's also one of those things that we have a lot of pressure on ourselves to prepare curriculum and doing it. You know, we talk about students procrastinating, but if we're generating real time curriculum for our class, we have like 3 days to make it before the class is delivered, and then the night before, all of a sudden a new press release comes out that completely obliterates our planning. So easier said than done, but certainly something that I like to strive towards.
And Antonio, yes, I mean, so going back to the point about case studies, do you find again some of these older ones are valuable, and how do you balance that older with the newer materials?
I mean, personally, because of the topic I teach, which is macroeconomics, I've stayed away from traditional case studies because I always found it difficult to talk for 90 minutes, for a typical 90-minute session, just about a narrow case, right? I use a lot of historical references to things that have happened in the macroeconomic world, which are important. They were important 20 years ago, and they're very relevant today. But I do like my students to immerse themselves in real-time data, because a lot of the MBAs do not have an economics background. They're not gonna have a job in the economics world. And the only way for them to really understand the reality of macroeconomics is by immersing themselves in what is happening as we speak. So, I mean, again, as an example that I mentioned briefly earlier, when I talk about central banks, in these days, there's a lot of talk about quantitative easing. What is the impact of quantitative easing? And people are lost. Again, they read lots of articles everywhere, and people have very different views on what quantitative easing is doing to the world. Now, it is so useful to just open in front of them the balance sheet of a central bank. I just tell them, pick whatever central bank you want. Let's go right there and let's see what their balance sheet looks like. Let's see in real action what this means. And once they see it, and of course they all understand how to read a balance sheet, this becomes real to them. It's not anymore this headline about central bank just printing money, which is obviously that's not what is happening, but it's something that becomes very real to them. And again, there's no historical case that would make it as real as looking at a balance sheet as we speak.
So Mary, there's a question here I see. Old case studies are frustratingly old, but sometimes, but published formal case studies have been tried and tested in the classroom. Would you agree?
Oh, I agree with that. But I think that given what I'm trying to do, bring students who have had a totally technical exposure to accounting topics and thinking about how much accounting has changed, going to more use of fair value measurements, which requires an understanding of market pricing, how information affects prices, audit being more data-driven, more real-time than it's been in the past, that for what I'm trying to do with my students to prepare them for an accounting profession that has changed rapidly in the last 5 years and is going to continue to change more rapidly, it's probably a better use of my time to rely more on recent materials.
So, and sort of the other side of that, I see we've got a question here. Maybe I'll go to Simon initially. When is real-time information too much information?
That's always a question.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Mary, you go ahead, and then I'll go to Simon. Go ahead, Mary.
Sometimes in my evaluations, my students will tell me that I give them too much and they don't have time to read all the material that I've sent them. And I don't know how to deal with that. I sort of feel you put out what you think is relevant, and people can choose to absorb it, or they can choose to not do much with it.
Simon.
Thanks. Let me tell you how I come at this. I think one of the challenges that our MBAs face and corporate decision makers face in general is they're just overwhelmed with information. So they need to be able to sort through what is information which is more relevant and less relevant. This is where I think the tools that we teach our MBAs become really important. So when I'm teaching them Porter's 5 forces, just imagine that that might be the right way to look at a problem. Then essentially, that's a position, you're taking a position that 5 sets of factors drive the overall profitability in a sector. And this is what should ultimately drive the strategy discussion. In which case, you read a newspaper article or some media content or real-time content, and you ask yourself, what of those 5 factors do I identify here? Or are there other factors which are being introduced? And so you help the MBA sort through what's relevant and not relevant. And as they practice doing this time and time again, they get so much faster and more efficient at absorbing information and sorting through it. And if you combine that approach plus getting them to think in terms of pyramid thinking, that ultimately they're going to be making a case and a recommendation for action, then they know what type of information they need to assemble, they know where to find it, they know how to filter it. And then in this way, we help our MBAs sort through the avalanche of information that they deluge themselves with on a daily basis. So I think that's how to take this discussion forward constructively.
Kevin, what about for you? When is real-time information too much?
Never. I think you're never. I always stress to the students that you will never have enough time to take all the information. That you have to decide how to prioritize it and how all of that comes together. I do think it's important to understand that sorting information and analyzing information are 2 completely different skills. And so I would say that as a faculty member for a lot of assignments, I'll do the sorting for them and say, here's the 2 or 3 relevant articles and pieces of information for you to use. Now analyze it. And then I have another bigger project where it's more of, here's the blue ocean, go in and just jump in and find out your own data resources and do your own analysis. So I try to split up those 2 different things because I have seen students get frustrated where they get stuck on the first step, where they're literally just they've sourced the wrong data points by going onto the internet and trying to find something, and now the rest of the assignment is ruined because they're in the garbage in, garbage out problem. So I think from my perspective, it's taking the 2 different things and isolating them, sorting versus analyzing.
Antonio, would you agree? You're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I also want to destroy what Simon said. I mean, I think there's obviously too much information for all of us out there, for our students, for ourselves. But I think what we try to do with this exercise is provide filters to our MBAs. I think we're trying to help them develop tools so that they can manage that information in a more efficient manner. So again, my feel, maybe it's just hope, is at the end of my course, I think, yes, there's still a lot of information out there, but now they're able to at least go by themselves and filter some of that information to get some relevant insights.
So there's a couple of questions here around younger students who perhaps actually don't have much practical business experience when they're coming to study for a master's. How to tackle that and how to get them to hit the ground running with case studies of events when their own hinterland, as it were, is relatively limited. Mary, any thoughts on that?
I think part of it is the way that you form groups, so that you've looked at the background of the students in your class, and you try to have a group that will have some students who have had, what you can tell from their background, significant work experience or significant experience in case-oriented classes. And then you put students in there who are less experienced. And you interact with the group enough that you can ensure that that student is playing a role in the group and not merely being pulled along by the others in the group. So it's kind of a learning from your peers, which is really what you do in a profession, is learn from your peers. So that works well for me.
Simon, any thoughts?
Yes, I mean, and I don't want to overgeneralize here, but when I see big age gaps in a group, typically the older students have, as you put it, Andrew, more hinterland, more experience to draw from, but the younger ones often pick up models and the value of abstract thinking faster. I think that's probably because they're still closer to their undergraduate education. And if you can get the younger ones to sort of tease out of the older ones, what information do they think is the most relevant? How could we use the tool? Then I think there's a productive conversation to have, because I think the tools and using the tools help you synthesize and synthesize the information, identify what's relevant, and the older ones can bring in factors which may be outside of a framework, but also the factors which are within it, and together there can be a productive conversation. And I think that's how to take this forward.
Yeah, Antonio, maybe linking to that, and there's a kind of related question here, which is there a danger that students may try to apply their learning in the real world when actually they don't yet have sufficient experience in management, for example, to make real world decisions that support their team?
I guess that's a question that one could ask about anything we do in a business school. I mean, my reaction would be first, I mean, the MBAs I deal with at INSEAD, they tend to have on average 5 years of experience. So we have very few students with limited experience. But sure, I think, I mean, when we teach them in the classroom, I mean, we try to build a path, sort of like to go forward very fast. Is everyone ready to go that fast? No, I'm sure they're gonna learn as they leave the program and they start working in the real world, that the real world sometimes is a lot more complicated than what we made it in the classroom. And that's gonna be a continued learning experience that they're gonna go through their careers. I mean, I hope we're realistic. I'm trying to be realistic when I put them in front of real-time data or any sort of learnings in my course. But sure, I mean, we all sometimes try to go too fast, and at some point we realize that what we face out there is even more complicated than what we were taught. Yeah.
Kevin, do you have that experience a little bit with some less experienced students and how to make it relevant?
I have a range of students in my class from undergraduates to PhD students. There's definitely a very, very big difference in what they bring into the class. At the end of the day, I try to throw it all at them at the same time and sort of cater some of the in-class discussions to some of their experiences. I think I echo what everyone else says. At the end of the day, people have their priors, and sometimes those are very valuable, and other times those are a lot less valuable. And pointing those out is always useful to have a lively classroom debate.
So let me stay with you for a second. And here's a sort of tech-related question then. So obviously we're all using Zoom here, and a lot of us found that a sort of very useful tool. But are these sorts of learning management systems, Zoom and other platforms online, are they making it easier? And in what ways to share real-time information as part of the whole teaching process, do you think?
I'm a little bit spoiled because at Stanford we do have a lab that we normally teach in, and so it's almost the same as Zoom, except it has a lot of money behind all the data resources that are there. So in my typical classroom, everyone's sitting down at a computer and interacting with each other already, and they can just click and have Bloomberg or CapIQ or FT or FactSet or whatever available to them at their fingertips. Now I'm stuck with the students on their own laptops that have far less robust software installed on it. So it has forced me to change my teaching styles and change some of the things I do, but I don't think it's necessarily the right comparison point for typical classes.
Mm-hmm. Mary, do you want to share some thoughts on how you share and integrate using online resources and learning management systems?
Well, I find that the chat function, that I will get questions that students probably wouldn't ask in class, but they will ask on the chat function. And so sometimes there are questions that are very, very relevant, but they just would not vocalize them. I also use videos. By nature, a lot of accounting is very technical, so you can easily have a class go flat. And so I try to, whenever I start a new topic like mergers and acquisitions, find a short video, 5-6 minutes at the most, which deals with some relatively recent merger and acquisition. And that, I hope, convinces students that this is a relevant topic. It's an important topic. Pay attention. You're going to learn something that's useful. And then when I'm teaching in the classroom, and I have picked out some of the very short less than 90-minute videos, and I keep an eye on them. And if there's one that relates to a current event, and the class goes flat, I can put that up and then use it as a basis for just a short discussion of how unexpected things happen all the time. And you have to be able to look at the unexpected thing and start thinking about what the short-term and the long-term implications are. And that takes a very short period of time, but it wakes people up.
Thanks, Antonio. What's your experience on this? And are you using, how are you sharing even resources, including online materials and so on, with your students, and how do they share with them with each other?
I wanted to add something related to what Kevin was saying. If I understood correctly, Kevin, when he's teaching his face-to-face class, everyone is already there with a laptop. So everyone was already accessing these tools. Now, many of us have struggled in the past with that question. Do we let our students have a laptop in class? Because if all the laptops are open, they start doing something else. And many of us have had norms that says, I don't want to see any laptop in the classroom, even if it sounds like really old style, but it's just a way to avoid distractions. Now, right now, as I'm teaching in Zoom, there's no way for me to say no laptops. I have to live with the fact that they all have a laptop open and they can do other things. So what I'm doing these days is trying to take advantage of something that I could not do before, which is what Kevin has always been doing, which is tell them, okay, now here it is. I'm going to post in the chat a link. You all click there, and then you figure out this number for this country, which is the country for your group or for your individuals, right? So I have the ability. It's so easy for me to share this data with them today. Now I have to trust them. I have to trust them that as they're looking at me, they're not doing something else on the computer, but that's life. Now my experience, I just finished teaching my core course here, at least from the comments of the students, I think everyone went through the experience in a very positive way. Again, they really appreciated the opportunities that we didn't give them before to use the computer, to use that window, to do things which are really exciting for the course. And in the past, we were always worried that they would be distracted. So we always told them no computers in the class.
Simon?
So I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues have said, but I do think the challenge when students have a laptop in front of them is to maintain their engagement. And we cannot do this with the traditional materials. They have to be exposed to different ideas, different content. You have to vary it over time. And I actively encourage the use of the chat function. I also ask questions, how many of you look at this problem and you see this? How many of you see that? Or what do you see? And so you get lots and lots of answers piling in on the chat, which you then interpret. To give you a sense, Andrew, of the volume of this, I was recently teaching our EMBA's economics, and in about a 6-hour day, I had between 350 and 550 comments in the chat, which I was then tracking as I'm talking. And then of course the students are raising their hands as well, using the raised hand functions. So I think for a faculty member, it's draining, but that's our job. We get it done, but to keep it engaged, to keep it really on the ball, and to keep them really engaged with the material, I think it can be doable. I think it's a completely different experience, and quite frankly, a much better experience. So that makes me think, the combination of good real-time insights plus our management of those insights and the flipped classroom, it offers a big step forward for MBA education.
Yeah, there's a comment here incidentally about how many international students don't necessarily have their own laptops and so have relied on accessing facilities at the institution. I guess a sobering point that not everyone always still has the perfect level of access in this online world.
Yeah.
But there's this question here, maybe I'll start with you, Simon, just around how far do we need to teach students what papers, media to read and how to read them before we ask them to use those sources to solve problems with?
I think this is a very good question, and it's one of the reasons why we introduced a section on critical thinking in our curriculum. It's precisely because critical thinking requires material, and critical material requires critical reading, and helping our MBAs understand where they can source higher quality content, how to sort through it, and then how to make their own arguments. This is important, and it speaks to perhaps a broader thing that I've learned for running my university's MBA program in 10 years is that often it is the most foundational learning skills in our MBAs which are the weakest. And actually, if you try and build on top of those very weak foundational skills, you will not get very far. So over time, we have had to address exactly this question, precisely because I think a lot of younger people have gone through life and have not had to rigorously and systematically filter information. And we have to help them do that if they have any chance of becoming first-rate decision makers, which is what we want them to be.
Antonio, would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the idea of like having that critical thinking and critical reading ability is key. I mean, what I typically do is I show them something which is a lot of words, lots of opinions about a particular topic. And then I say, okay, let's see if we agree with this or not. And then we need data. We need data to test this hypothesis. So then we go to the database where we can interact with data and they tell me, okay, if that was true, then you would observe this type of pattern. Is that the pattern that we see? So, I mean, I tend to do that myself all the time. I tend to tell them, look, let's not stop at the words. Let's look at the data. Let's look at the evidence and let's see whether we believe that this is right or not.
Sure. Kevin or Mary, do you want to comment on this at all?
One thing that I use in getting ready to set the class up for reading a lot, it's a very old book by Mortimer Adler about how to read a book. And I don't bring that text itself into the class, but I draw on it to talk about how you read differently depending on why you're reading and what you're reading. And then I use some of his insights on how to listen, how to talk, in talking about the importance of listening. And I think probably in today's environment, helping students develop listening skills, really careful listening skills, and then summarizing and commenting on what they've heard is more important than it's ever been. I'm not quite sure how to do that, but I think that is part of what needs to be in my classes.
Kevin?
I don't have anything insightful to add beyond what they've already said.
Well, let me come to you then on another. There's 2 or 3 questions around assessment. So what ways are there to assess students when using real-time information? What approaches do you use?
From my perspective, I guess 2 different things. One is we use real-time quote information, and it's frustrating, but at the same time great. I do have them download real-time prices, for example, oil prices or something like that, and then calculate some sort of measurement that we use in class. And it means you can't rely on the auto grader. You have to say, hey, give me the numbers that you've gotten sourced for screenshot off of the website. You apply the formula that I've taught you in class, and everybody's inputs and everybody's outputs are slightly different, and that's just the way it comes together. And so that it's an easy way of assessing. It's just it's better for me than giving them the numbers and saying use these exact results. I find that to be a little bit tedious. The other side is qualitatively. It's having them look at information and then make a qualitative assessment and then write a result, and then I'm judging that result. What I'm typically trying to do is not judge the results whether or not I agree or disagree with their analysis. I'm more thinking about the framework of thinking that they've applied, the knowledge that they have sourced, and how they're putting it together. If they have some sort of forecast that has no bearing based on the information they've given, then that's going to get a bad result. Once again, it's none of this is easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it is certainly possible.
Simon, any thoughts about assessment and including incidentally on students' knowledge of current affairs more generally and how important that is?
We get strong signals from employers that they expect our students to be aware of what's going on in the outside world. Now, to be frank, many younger people, many MBAs, they don't share that assumption when they come in. They think that if they can look it up, they'll understand it. And then quite often they don't know where to look it up. So we actually emphasize that they need to be on top of corporate developments and public policy. And so we will question them about that. And that shows up either by asking them specific questions during oral exams about current events, or when they tackle a case, we will ask them, well, okay, what happened since? And they know that they are held to that they are expected to be up to date on analyzing what a company or where a company's at. So if we gave them that 3N case that I gave you, that I mentioned earlier, we would expect them to know what happened since they published their fourth quarter results from last year. And so this just raises the expectations of them, and they internalize these higher expectations. Unfortunately, when they go out into the job market, those expectations are validated by the very employers who tell us what they want. So I think that's how to tackle it.
Antonio, any thoughts again on assessment? What to be done using real-time information?
I mean, to me, it's sort of a straightforward. I mean, when I do an assignment for them, I'm going to ask them to look at some real data that they can find somewhere on a database that has the most current data that I want them to use. When I write my exams, typically the weekend before I have to write my exam, I go to the Financial Times and I find a few pieces of news, comments, and I literally every single question has a quote from the Financial Times. That's how I write my exams. And the idea is the ability to analyze these current events and the current data that I'm giving them. To me, that's how they prove to me that they've learned the insights of the course.
Mm-hmm. Mary, any final thoughts on that?
My approach is similar to Antonio's, and I think that in today's environment, you have to really walk away from using a lot of multiple choice questions. They're very easy for us as professors, but it's so hard to monitor no matter what type of software you're using, whether the answers are coming from an individual student. So I think in terms of preparing people for professional life, that as time consuming as it is, that the assessments have to be primarily based on written presentations, creation of oral presentations, perhaps videos. I haven't done that yet, but I think that could be a way to assess performance, but less and less reliance on multiple choice because of the problems with monitoring, and that it's more technical memorization than real learning.
So we're coming, unfortunately, already to the end. It's amazing how quickly the hour's gone. But let me just sort of wrap up by going around each of you. And there's a sort of, I suppose, really, it would be great to hear your reflections or your wish almost, if there was one thing more that perhaps the providers of real-time information could offer, either in terms of the nature of the material or ways in which it could be more effectively and meaningfully integrated into the curriculum. What would it be? There's an idea here about a live curriculum. So perhaps, for example, with case data that could update itself automatically. There's perhaps an interesting one on the wish list. Kevin, any thoughts from you on that?
Ooh, that's a really tough question. I think actually here's a random pitch to you. Having a comment section that was for like specific type like authorized individuals, for example, faculty members, to comment and have their own discussion on articles. If you could get that ecosystem going, would be really interesting to have its own little separate thread.
Okay, thanks. Mary?
I think the way that Times is organized makes it really easy to find what you're looking for. The way it's divided into sections, and you can go into Lex or you can go into Alphaville. And then the videos, they're easy to get into. I'm sure there are ways that it could be improved, but when I think about preparing for class 5 years ago and preparing today, it's much richer environment than it was 5 years ago. So we're moving in the right direction.
That's great to hear. And Antonio, and don't feel either in your critiques or your suggestions of best practices, you need to limit yourself to the FT, but in terms of real-time information, news, data, and so on, what would be on your wish list?
I think there's a need to do something that looks like a live curriculum. I think the old teaching cases or books, I think that's not the way forward. I mean, I've been fighting myself with publishers that come always with requests for books. And when I tell them the idea of writing a live book, something which is not a traditional book, where the data is alive in some form which is not at all the one we are used to, most of them, they don't know what to do with that idea. And I've been pitching this for many, many years. And I think we collectively have to find a way to create a set of materials that are live, that look like the traditional cases, but they're not dead anymore. They're moving, and we can all use them, as opposed to, as Kevin said before, all of us are reinventing the wheel and sort of coming up with our own materials in different corners of the world.
Thanks. Simon, a final word to you.
I endorse the idea of developing. I'm sure it would become a live curriculum, but the idea that especially we need to help junior faculty who may not have thought through all the different options or have seen the different options, and so laying out examples for them, so which they can then apply their own creativity on top of, I think is the way forward. So some type of course by course examples of how to use real-time information and then wrap that up into this live curriculum sounds like a great package.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our hour. Tremendous contributions from all of you. So thank you very much for your insights, and thanks everyone who tuned in and shared their own reflections and questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them, try to do most, but I see there's a number here that also touch on some of the wider challenges around business education going forwards. And a reminder that next week, July the 14th, at the same time, you can tune in for our final one of these 3 webinars where we'll talk to some great other senior leaders of MBA programs around the world to hear their reflections more generally on the MBA and the challenges of business education in the COVID and post-COVID era. So thank you all again, everybody. You'll get a follow-up email and you'll be able to come back and look at this video if you want to and share it with others. And equally, do feel free to share your other wider thoughts and reflections. It's been a great discussion, and thanks very much for joining.